You probably grew up hearing that Rome was invincible, an empire so powerful, so disciplined, and so grand that it seemed as if it had been built by the gods themselves. And you know what's interesting about that? That idea is exactly the kind of myth history loves to create about winners, sweeping under the rug everything that doesn't fit the perfect narrative. The truth, as it almost always is far more interesting and far more human than the myth. Because Rome wasn't just an empire of victories, it was an empire that learned how to survive its own defeats. And that difference completely changes the way you'll see not just history, but everything around you. What few people tell you is that some of the most decisive moments in Roman history were not great conquests, they were brutal humiliations inflicted by enemies Rome underestimated, ignored, or simply didn't know how to face. A Gallic leader who sacked the city and demanded gold with a smile on his face, a Greek king who won every battle and still lost the war, a Carthaginian general who crossed the Alps with elephants and nearly wiped Rome off the map, an Iberian guerrilla leader Rome couldn't defeat in battle and had to assassinate in his sleep, a Germanic warrior trained by the legions themselves who destroyed them in a forest, and a Persian king who captured a Roman emperor alive and had it carved in stone for the world to see. 6 enemies, 6 humiliations, and 6 lessons that shaped the greatest empire the world has ever known. The reason you need to know these stories goes far beyond historical curiosity. It's because each of these defeats carries a pattern, a logic, a lesson that repeats itself in completely different contexts, whether in business, relationships, or personal life. Understanding how Rome fell, rose again, and reinvented itself in the face of each of these adversaries is to understand something profound about resilience, adaptation, and the difference between brute strength and strategic intelligence. This is the kind of knowledge very few people seek, and the kind that makes all the difference in how you face your own adversaries, whoever they may be. And if you enjoy this kind of content, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. That way you won't miss any stories. So sit back because this story is about to begin. Rome in the 4th century BC was not the invincible colossus that history often glorifies. It was a city still under construction, ambitious but exposed, with vulnerable borders and an army that was still in its early stages of organization. Northern Italy was boiling with Celtic tribes led by a name that would soon echo like a warning: Brennus. He wasn't a general trained in military academies, he was something more dangerous. A natural leader commanding a tribal army that moved like a human avalanche, fast, brutal, and completely unpredictable. The Gauls didn't march in disciplined cadence, they exploded on impact, betting everything on the initial shock and the chaos that shattered any unprepared formation. And Rome, accustomed to a certain pattern of warfare, was caught completely off guard. The result of that combination came brutally at the Battle of the Allia River, where the Romans made mistakes any experienced general would recognize as fatal. Poor positioning, disorganized lines, and a level of confidence that bordered on arrogance, the kind of error that happens when you underestimate your enemy before the fight even begins. The collapse was so fast it shocked even the Gauls themselves, and with the path wide open, Brennus marched on Rome, sacked the city, and imposed humiliating terms by demanding gold in exchange for leaving. It was then that he delivered the words that would be burned into Roman memory forever: "Vae victis," woe to the vanquished. Only the Capitoline Hill held out, while the rest of the city was abandoned and devastated in a scene the Romans had never imagined possible. On that day, it became clear: the defeated had no rights, only the choice between paying or dying. This episode created a collective trauma that deeply shaped the Roman military mindset from that point forward. Fortifications were strengthened, discipline was treated as sacred, and the fear of the Gauls became almost a cultural obsession. But here's the most fascinating part of it all. It was precisely Brennus's humiliation that planted the seed of the empire Rome would become. Like a student who only starts studying seriously after failing a test, Rome needed that shock to wake up and rebuild its foundations on much stronger ground. The pain of defeat, when properly processed, has a transformative power that no easy victory can offer, and Rome learned that lesson the hard way. And speaking of enemies who forced Rome to evolve, the next name on this list came from even farther away, bringing with him elephants, Greek philosophy, and a form of warfare the Romans had never seen before. If Brennus taught Rome how to defend itself, the next enemy came to deliver an even more sophisticated lesson: the difference between winning battles and winning wars. Pyrrhus, king of Epirus, was a man of Homeric ambition. Inspired by the military model of Alexander the Great, he crossed the Mediterranean with a clear objective: to defend the Greek cities of southern Italy from Roman expansion and perhaps build an empire in the west. He arrived with the most advanced military tools of his time: the powerful Macedonian phalanx, heavy cavalry coordinated with surgical precision, and a psychological weapon the Romans had never faced before: war elephants. For Roman soldiers, seeing those massive creatures advancing for the first time, it must have felt like pure panic. At the battles of Heraclea and Asculum, Pyrrhus demonstrated undeniable tactical superiority, defeating the Romans with a level of military elegance that bordered on spectacle. But each victory came at an extremely high cost in lives, and unlike Rome, he had no way to replace those losses. This is where one of the most powerful concepts in military history emerges: the Pyrrhic victory. A victory that is, in reality, a disguised defeat, because the cost of achieving it outweighs the benefit it brings. Rome, on the other hand, had an advantage that Pyrrhus completely underestimated. It could lose battles, retreat, reorganize, and come back stronger, while he slowly bled with every triumph. It's almost like an entrepreneur who closes major deals but spends more than he earns on each one. In the end, the math simply doesn't work. What makes Pyrrhus one of the most fascinating enemies in Roman history is that he was never directly defeated on the battlefield. He simply became unsustainable, forced to retreat without achieving what he set out to do. But the legacy he left was transformative. Rome studied every move of that brilliant general, absorbed lessons in tactical flexibility, refined its legions, and emerged from the conflict as a far more sophisticated war machine than the one that entered it. Pyrrhus's moral defeat was, paradoxically, one of Rome's greatest intellectual victories, and this ability to learn from its enemies would soon be tested by an enemy even more brilliant, even more relentless, and one who came closer than anyone else to doing the unthinkable: wiping Rome off the map. Few names in military history send the same chill down the spine as Hannibal Barca, a Carthaginian general who, while still young, swore eternal hatred against Rome and spent his whole life fulfilling that promise with terrifying competence. His opening move was already a masterstroke. Instead of attacking Rome by sea as everyone expected, he marched over land, crossing the Alps with an entire army, including cavalry, infantry, and war elephants, in a maneuver the Romans themselves considered impossible. By the time the legions realized what was happening, Hannibal was already inside Italy, rested and ready to strike, carrying the morale of a man who had just proven to the world that impossible is just a word used by those afraid to try. What followed was a series of Roman defeats that are still studied today in the world's top military academies. At the Trebia, Hannibal used the weather and a perfectly timed ambush to destroy an entire Roman army. At Lake Trasimene, he lured the legions into confined terrain and slaughtered them before they could even reorganize. But it was at Cannae that he delivered his masterpiece, a battle where he was outnumbered and still managed to completely surround the Roman army, annihilating between 50 and 70,000 soldiers in a single day, in a double envelopment maneuver that is still considered the perfect model of military encirclement. The psychological impact was devastating. Rome entered an existential crisis. allies began to defect, and for the first time in its history, there was a real sense that the city might simply cease to exist. It wasn't exaggeration, it was a cold assessment of reality. And yet, Rome survived. Hannibal, despite all his brilliance, ran into an obstacle no tactic could overcome: the lack of logistical support from Carthage, which failed to send sufficient reinforcements, and the absence of siege equipment to take the city directly. He spent years roaming Italy, winning battles, but unable to deliver the final blow, while Rome, with its characteristic stubbornness, reorganized, adapted, and waited for the right moment to turn the tide. Hannibal left the war defeated, but he carved the deepest scar in Roman military history, permanently transforming how the legions thought, planned, and fought. And speaking of warriors who used intelligence to challenge Rome, the next name on this list did something even more remarkable. He defeated the greatest army in the world using nothing but terrain and cunning, without elephants, without phalanxes, and without any resource beyond sheer human ingenuity. If Hannibal challenged Rome with resources, elephants, and an army trained in the Hellenistic tradition, Viriathus did something far more unsettling. He challenged the greatest empire in the world with almost nothing. Born in the Iberian Peninsula, of humble origin and without any of the privileges that shaped the great generals of his time, he became a leader of Lusitanian resistance through the strength of two attributes no military academy can teach: genuine skill and a charisma that could move mountains. Rome had already dominated much of the known world, but Hispania had a problem named Viriathus, and that problem stubbornly refused to follow the script the Romans had written. He had no legions, no endless resources, no powerful allies, but he had something far more valuable. He knew every stone, every valley, and every path of that land better than any Roman general ever could. What Viriathus developed was a form of warfare that turned the Roman playbook upside down. Rapid strikes, strategic withdrawals, surgical ambushes, and such an intelligent use of terrain that the legions simply couldn't pin him down in battle. It's like trying to hold smoke with your hands. The more the Roman army advanced, the more Viriathus withdrew, reorganized, and attacked from another angle. Roman defeats piled up in humiliating fashion until Rome found itself facing something that rarely happened: the need to negotiate, to temporarily recognize the authority of an Iberian leader, and to admit, between the lines, that its legions were not enough to solve that problem. For an empire used to dictating the rules, sitting at the negotiating table with Viriathus was a silent but deafening defeat. Unable to defeat him in open battle, Rome resorted to the only weapon left when force fails: betrayal. Close allies of Viriathus were bribed and assassinated him in his sleep, ending in cowardly fashion a story that should never have ended that way. But the legacy he left was far greater than any single battle. He proved definitively that a smaller force can defeat a superpower when it masters intelligence, terrain knowledge, and asymmetric strategy. Viriathus was, in essence, a precursor to what we now call guerrilla warfare, and his story echoes in every conflict in human history where the weak challenged the powerful and refused to bend the knee. And speaking of using knowledge of the enemy as a weapon, the next name on this list took that concept to an even more devastating level, because he didn't just know Rome, he was raised by it. Imagine dedicating years of your life to serving an empire, learning its language, wearing its armor, studying every detail of its tactics and strategies, and then using all of that to destroy it from within. That is exactly what Arminius did, and that's why he holds a unique place on this list of enemies who humiliated Rome. The son of a Germanic chieftain, he was trained by the Roman army itself, granted citizenship, served as an auxiliary officer, and gained insider knowledge of the legions that no external enemy could ever access. Rome saw him as a loyal ally, a successful integration, and it was precisely that blind trust that Arminius turned into a weapon. because there is no greater vulnerability than fully trusting someone who has already decided to betray you. The plan he devised was chilling in its precision. Using a fabricated revolt as a pretext, he convinced the Roman governor Publius Quinctilius Varus to march 3 entire legions into the Teutoburg forest, a maze of dense trees, treacherous swamps, and terrain that rendered Roman military formations completely useless. For 3 consecutive days, the legions were attacked from all sides, with no room to reorganize, no visibility, and no ability to use the very strengths that made them unbeatable in open battle. It was a systematic and methodical massacre. By the end, 3 full legions had been annihilated, their sacred standards captured, and Varus, disgraced and with no way out, took his own life. When the news reached Rome, Emperor Augustus is said to have cried out in despair, "Varus, give me back my legions." The impact of that event was so profound that Rome made a decision it had never made before. It gave up. Expansion into Germania was permanently abandoned. The Rhine River became the definitive frontier, and an entire people escaped Romanization because of the strategic vision of a single man. Arminius demonstrated something the greatest strategists in history have always understood. Insider knowledge is more valuable than any numerical or technological superiority because it allows you to strike exactly where it hurts most. And if the defeat in the forest was the moment Rome lost its legions, the next chapter of this story holds something even more unthinkable. The moment Rome lost something that seemed impossible to lose: the emperor himself. If there is an image that captures the ultimate humiliation of a superpower, it was carved in stone by the Persians in the 3rd century AD, literally. Shapur I, king of the Sasanian Empire, not only defeated Rome in battle, he captured Emperor Valerian alive, something that had never happened in all Roman history, and sounded as absurd as it was impossible to any Roman of that time. To understand the weight of that moment, you need to remember that Rome was living through one of its most turbulent periods. The crisis of the 3rd century had turned the empire into a rusted machine, with vulnerable borders, chronic political instability, and emperors who lasted less time in power than some wheat harvests. Shapur I saw this weakness with the clarity of someone watching an opponent stumble and calmly choosing the exact moment to strike. The Sasanian military campaigns against the Roman East were coordinated, aggressive, and devastating. Shapur didn't improvise. He applied constant pressure on Roman provinces until the system collapsed. At the Battle of Edessa, Emperor Valerian was defeated and captured alive, in an event that shook the ancient world the way an earthquake shakes a poorly built structure. And Shapur did not waste the moment. He ordered monumental reliefs to be carved depicting the Roman emperor kneeling before him, turning military humiliation into long-lasting political propaganda. It was a clear message to the entire world. Rome could be defeated, its emperor could be captured, and the idea of Roman supremacy was, after all, just an idea. The shock caused by this event went beyond the military. It struck something far more fragile and far more powerful at the same time: Rome's image as an invincible and untouchable force. Internally, the crisis of confidence deepened. Externally, imperial prestige crumbled before the eyes of allies and enemies alike. Shapur I proved that Rome could be defeated not only on the battlefield, but on the symbolic level, in that space where great powers build their authority long before any war begins. And it is exactly there, in this combination of military defeat and symbolic blow, that the most powerful lesson of these 6 enemies resides. A lesson that goes far beyond ancient history and speaks to something fundamental about how empires, organizations, and individuals build, lose, and rebuild their strength over time. These 6 enemies you've just seen did not defeat Rome by chance, nor because Rome was weak. They won because each of them, in their own way, found the exact crack in a system that seemed perfect. Brennus exploited the military immaturity of a city still in formation. Pyrrhus exposed the tactical limits of the legions with a Hellenistic elegance that ultimately cost him his own campaign. Hannibal nearly wiped Rome off the map with a level of strategic genius the world has rarely seen repeated. Viriathus proved that knowledge of terrain and cunning outweigh entire armies. Arminius used Rome against itself, turning the training he received into a devastating weapon. And Shapur I struck where it hurt most, not just the body, but the soul of the empire, capturing the ultimate symbol of Roman power. Each of these men read their opponent with a depth the Romans, at that moment, simply did not expect. But here's the detail that transforms this story of defeats into one of the greatest lessons in resilience in human history. Rome lost to all of them and still continued to exist, grow, and become greater after each fall. That wasn't luck, and it wasn't arrogance either. It was a unique ability to turn humiliation into learning, to look at defeat without looking away, and extract exactly what was needed to avoid making the same mistake twice. It's the same principle that separates people, companies, and civilizations that endure from those that disappear at the first storm. Rome was not invincible, it was relentless. And that distinction changes everything. The true strength of Rome was never in its legions, its walls, or its generals. It was in its collective ability to absorb impact, reorganize, and move forward with more wisdom than before. And that lesson echoes across centuries because it doesn't just speak about an ancient empire, it speaks to anyone who has ever been knocked down and had to decide whether to stay on the ground or rise again with greater clarity about where they went wrong. Every defeat carries a lesson within it.